So we've learned the basics of HTML and we've learned the basics of CSS. And now we're going to talk a little bit more about how those two things come together. So I've changed the page we were working on a little bit. It's mostly a collection of H1s and P tags now. There's a little less styling. I still have the glory of Comic Sans on here, but it's not as aggressive because it doesn't have a background anymore. I've added 3 buttons down at the bottom instead of just 1, and we're still just stuck with 1 link down there. So a situation that you sometimes come across is you want some of the page to change, but not other parts of the page to change. So for example, I have all of my P tags, and I say, make them all have the font size 16 and make them all Arial. So every single one of these is the same. But then I think, oh, this up here is a byline, and I want our byline to be a little bit smaller. Now you could try to change it to the byline tag, but it turns out the byline tag doesn't exist, right? So we're going to use a P tag to represent this. If we wanted to make it smaller, we might change this to 12, save, refresh. But unfortunately, this changed every single other paragraph on the page too. So sometimes what you want to do is just grab a few elements that have something in common, even though they have the same tag. So what we do is we are going to learn about something called classes, which are kind of like categories. So I'm going to say, hey, put this into a category or a class called byline. Take this one down here, also put it in a category or a class called byline. And I'm first going to do that in the HTML. So class is an attribute. So class equals byline. So now this P tag here has the attribute class with the value of byline. And I'm going to do the same thing for this byline here. Class equals byline. I'm going to save, and then everything looks exactly the same. When you add classes, it doesn't necessarily do anything. It doesn't make anything happen. It's just a way of describing more specifically, perhaps, what this P tag is, what category of P tag we have here. But the fun part is that we can go now into our CSS up here, and we can make a rule about that byline. So if I say, go make a rule about the byline, you'll be like, I got this. I know what this is. Byline, font size, 12 pixels, beautiful. Now you already know something has gone wrong because byline didn't light up in the same way that H1 and P did. So syntax highlighting is really good for knowing when you're screwing something up. So save, refresh, yeah, obviously didn't do anything. So when you are talking about something that you want to style, remember the word selector? You use a selector. So we use the selector H1 to find all of the H1 tags, the selector P to find all of the P tags. But now we want to find the bylines, and we don't want to find the bylines by the tag name, because the tag name is P. We want to find them by the class name. And the way that you do that is instead of typing byline, you type dot byline. And you say, interesting, why is it dot byline? And I say, I don't know. It's programming. That's how programming works. We just accept it. Refresh, and there we go. Now it's nice and small. So we could add other things to this. Color 333. You're like, what? That's not a color. It is a color. We'll talk about that later. And so now it lightens up a little bit. You can put classes on anything. So for example, if we have these buttons down here, this is a normal button, this is a normal button, and this is a submit button. So maybe we want this submit button to stand out a little bit against those other buttons. So I'm going to say class equals submit. So I'm putting the submit button into a category or a class called submit. And if we want to make a rule about this, I will say dot submit, because dot means class, and maybe background black, color white, so it becomes an inverted button, so it stands out a little bit more. It's still very ugly, yes, we'll solve that problem later with Bootstrap. Now, you can't put spaces inside of classes. So if I called this story byline, I couldn't say dot story byline. Actually, technically, is that going to work? No. So what happens is, if you put a space in here, that space means these are two different classes. So right now, this p tag here, this paragraph, has the class of story and the class of byline. So if I make a rule up here that's for byline, if I save it, it'll still work because one of those two classes is byline. And if I wanted to get crazy, I could say story, background red, and now this p tag here is absorbing both the rules about story and the rules about byline and the rules about p. So it's really combining all these things together. That looks ugly though, so I'm going to get rid of it. Now, it seems like this should be enough. And it would have been, but it's not. I'm sorry. The way the world works is, along with classes, along with categories, there's also something called ID. ID equals, we'll call it main. It's the main title on the page, I don't know. Now, IDs are exactly the same as classes. I can go up here and I can make a rule about this h1 just because it has the ID of main. But instead of dot main, color black, it's pound main. So if I make a class, dot, class gets dot, class gets dot, class gets dot, class gets dot. If I make an ID, it gets a pound symbol. Why? It's programming. It's the rules. It's just how things go. So what happens is, in theory, classes are supposed to be used when you have multiple elements that are going to share that style. So if I have a bunch of different bylines, class equals byline. If I only had one byline on a page, they would want me to say ID equals byline. Because in the same way that you can have an identification card for yourself, an ID that just says, this is just me, this is only me, this is my ID that is only for me, you're saying this is the only thing that is going to have the ID of main. This is unique across the page. But why does that matter? Because you just make the rules anyway, right? The only difference is one gets a pound and one gets a dot. I could change this to class equals main, save it, and it will look exactly the same because it's exactly the same thing. The difference is, in like 20 years, when you're doing a bunch of crazy CSS, an ID is more powerful than a class. So like, if a class and an ID are fighting with each other, the ID will win out. But like, who cares? No one cares. Literally, no one on the planet has any interest in this. So you just need to know, though, that classes and IDs are basically the same thing. But generally, you'll end up using classes. And you can use classes to take specific styles and not have them apply to an entire tag, not have them apply to every single P on the page, but just have them apply to one among the many. So it's a way of, picking out a certain category of P tag, a certain category of link, a certain category of button, and saying, we're going to have a special style just for this.